By way of introduction, I'm a partner in E&Y's national office and chief auditor, and really looking forward to sharing views with you and our panelists around the observations of the virtual audit that Mark mentioned. I'm joined today by three kind of excellent panelists who I'll quickly introduce, and if you want to know more information about them and their bios, I think there you can reference your program materials. But maybe I'll start with you, Jen Haskell, who's a partner in Deloitte's national office and their chief auditor. Welcome, Jen.
Hi, Josh.
Next, I'll start with Dave Sharpe, who's a partner in PwC's national office and kind of the head of their methodology and tools area. So Dave, great to see you and happy to have you here as well.
Thanks, Josh. Hi, everyone.
And then last but certainly not least, we have Christopher Tower from BDO, who's their National Assurance Managing Partner of Audit Quality and Professional Practice. And so, Christopher, always great to see you as well. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Josh.
So I think, before we get jumping in, I guess it's a couple of things. As Mark mentioned, we're here to share some perspectives with the group here around, observations we learned from the virtual audit. We would like this to be as interactive as possible. So we have saved time, for questions from you. So please, feel free to use the Q&A function as we go through the presentation. If any questions come to mind, we can certainly try to address them as we move through the discussion, but certainly we'll have some time at the end as well for any additional questions that may come up. But I guess maybe just to jump right in, I guess, I have to admit when I reflect on the symposium last year, I can't say I fully appreciated that we still be talking about virtual auditing, 12 months from last August. And so, I think we've certainly learned a lot on the fly about how to deal with audits from a virtual perspective, not only how maybe the pandemic is impacting the financial statements themselves, but how we work within our teams as well as with our clients to perform audits in a remote environment. So very much look forward to sharing with you some of the things that we learned worked well, some of the things we continue to work through, and give you a sense as to maybe some of the impacts this will have longer term on how we perform audits kind of going forward. And so let's jump right in and talk maybe a little bit about kind of some of the things we learned coming out of busy season from this past year. And maybe Dave, I'll start with you. And we think about all we had to pivot to so quickly when we had to pivot to the virtual environment so quickly. What are some of the early challenges that you saw the engagement teams had to grapple with, and maybe how can you provide some perspective on how your firm adapted to those challenges?
Sure. Sounds good, Josh. I think I'll take a couple minutes to set all this up, but I think it's important. So much has passed, as you said, to go back, right? At the time of the lockdown, as Josh said, most December 31st audits were substantially complete. But at the same time, we all had other year-end audits in progress. So I'm referring to the January year ends, the March year ends, and so forth. And at the time of the lockdown, the March 31st physical inventory observations were upon us. So we began reaching out to engagement teams right away, and we continued doing that because it proved to be very valuable. And we took the lessons learned and the feedback from the March year ends, the May year ends, the June year ends, and September and so forth, and continually refreshed our plan. And that feedback, kind of informed our planning and helped us calibrate our plan going forward. The early challenges, Josh, that you referred to primarily had to do with financial reporting and audit evidence matters, like kind of square one, step one. And I'm referring to things like updating our audit risk and materiality assessments, including fraud risk assessment, where appropriate for changed circumstances. And then, of course, addressing potential impairment, going concern assessments, and the related testing, especially for client operations in sectors that were adversely impacted. Then importantly, we needed to design virtual inventory procedures, inventory observation procedures, virtual business process and control reviews, importantly, to identify potential changes in controls, and things like virtual board minute reviews to gather the required audit evidence. And finally, we needed to assess digital evidence, which, to some degree was new for some clients and some teams. And that digital audit evidence, we, sometimes needed to perform additional verification procedures. And I'm referring not only to underlying transaction documents, but things like audit confirmations, legal letters, as well as management representation letters. Now, as I mentioned, many teams had already been doing this, but the increase in electronic documents was new to some clients. Now then, as things progressed, we kind of moved on from the what around audit procedures and evidence requirements and quickly got focused on addressing, I'll say, the behaviors and working practices or ways of working for how to do it well. And that's the how. And then the why, in terms of making all of this work for a good people experience for our teams and a good client experience. And these were things like, as Mark said, maintaining audit quality, maintaining professional skepticism while working remotely, and again, being alert to potential changes in ICFR. Undertaking supervision and review, which was had some unique aspects to it while working remotely. And then I think importantly, things like project management and phasing of the level of effort. I'll come back to that in a second. Maintaining a coaching and development culture while working remotely. Client relationship management. And lastly, just overall readiness for the 2021 year-end audit cycle. And the last thing I'll say, Josh, is not only did this include keeping the audits on track, but also continuing to support things like interim reviews, client transactions, and debt offerings. And I think all of us had, many clients that chose to access the capital markets during this time frame. And so not only were we focused on audit quality, keeping audits on track, but also the things that go with in terms of interim reviews or business combinations and other client transactions, as well as debt offerings. So hopefully, Josh, that kind of sets us up here.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Dave. I appreciate that. And I think you covered a number of areas that I think as we move through the discussion, we'll unpack even more so. But I think that does a nice job really helping frame kind of the landscape we were all faced with, this time last year, if not a little bit sooner. One of the things you focused on early on in your discussion was risk assessment, right? And how the pandemic, maybe it might have impacted our risk assessment, as well as, how moving to a remote environment, I think, when you think about risk assessment, how moving to a remote environment might have created some new or additional risks from, to the audit process. And maybe Christopher, I'll turn to you. And I guess as you think about, kind of the impact of all that on our risk assessment, can you speak at all about how this may have impacted your expectations related to fraud risks or other kind of challenging areas in the audit, and how maybe, you guys may have done anything to help navigate that in the remote environment?
Josh, what fraud risk? What could you possibly be talking about, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So I think when you unpack it using your term, which I think is a great term, virtual environments, especially since both we and our clients moved to those environments pretty fully, I would think, really did create an increased pressure, rationale, and opportunity for fraud. So when you think about what are the sources of that? Probably the lack of oversight that may have occurred and still may be occurring at clients, and temporary or maybe not temporary alterations to controls and processes and procedures. So I think Dave talked a little bit about how do you respond to that? What are the things you do? So one of the things we brought out to the practice, which was really getting the teams to inquire deeply about changes to process and controls, really get a strong understanding as to how things have changed and how they're doing them differently. And, you know, on the first blush, you would think, it sounds like they're doing it the same way. But if you dug a little deeper, you actually found out that a lot changed. Another example, which we encourage teams to do, was to use data analytics in a meaningful way. So we've been really pushing hard on teams to use data analytics, and luckily, I think for all of the firms on this call and the other firms that are listening in, it's finally evolved to a level that it was highly impactful to help look for identifying indicators of unusual activity. So data analytics, I think, was very, very helpful. We also encourage discussions, deep discussions around fraud and highly judgmental areas like significant estimates, to be done in person if possible during these remotes. Actually, some of them did happen, very distant conversations in person, or at least on video. So you could have visual interaction, visual communication. And the last thing we did to respond, well, actually, one of many things, we did a lot more, but one of the more impactful things I think is we doubled down on professional skepticism, which is really important. And we did this by providing refresher and scenario training on our professional judgment framework. And we actually found this to be highly impactful.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, Christopher. I think all of those things are certainly familiar from my perspective. You know, I think being deliberate on how you go look for potential changes, and then, you know, trying to replace kind of as much as you can the interactions virtually as you could, to try to make them look as though they were in person as much as you can was helpful as well. We certainly tried to do the same thing as well, tried to get on site as much as we could, but as you might guess, this past year was a challenge to do. So really encouraging video was something we leveraged. And then you're right, data can provide a source of information around, hey, are elements of the process operating differently than what you expected, right? So it was a very interesting time. Really, we saw teams really embrace that more so because, you know, getting the data in many cases was something that they had more time, and they saw the value in it, maybe even more so than they saw previously. So I think those are great. You know, maybe Jen, just coming over to you. I know, you know, obviously Christopher mentioned, you know, that, you know, clients obviously had to change, you know, their way of operating in many cases due to the pandemic and switch to working remotely. I mean, can you speak a little bit to, you know, some of the impacts you saw in your team's interactions with clients and how they dealt with that switch?
And I think, like most things, the answer was it depended. It depended on a lot of factors at the client. But I would say, stepping back, I think, you know, when I look across our clients, it went surprisingly well for a significant majority of those clients. And if we look at things like, you know, how many companies took advantage of the SEC filing extensions, for example, proportionally, it's a pretty small balance, as were reports of material changes and controls. So for some clients, this was a continuation, a little bit like our firms, of the digitization journey, and it made moving to remote really, you know, quickly was not a big deal for them. And one of the key factors, I think, was where companies are at in terms of their controls and processes and digitization efforts. You know, we saw a lot of people have to sort of overnight move out. What were their GITCs around access controls, for example? How quickly were they able to respond to that? And then there were some other factors that Dave and Christopher have already mentioned, which is sort of like taking a walk down memory lane 12 months out, except we're still in it, aren't we? But at the very beginning, you know, certain industries were getting hit really hard. And the volatility, I think, overall, just you know, nobody really had any expectations of at a macroeconomic perspective how this was going to impact us. So dealing with clients having to deal with the volatility in their estimates, particularly those with March and April year ends. Did they have the right specialists? Did they need to get specialists they hadn't previously thought they might need? So those sorts of considerations were going through their minds. From a global perspective, you know, big MNCs in different stages of digitization or different IT systems across their network globally. How were they dealing with consolidation and other issues? And I think we still see some of that with the kind of waves that are hitting different parts of the world at different times, even today, is, you know, how are clients able to deal with that level of volatility with respect to COVID itself. So lots of variables. What we encourage teams to do is to sit down and go through the facts and circumstances of each engagement separately and try to figure out those variables in terms of what the right path to audit execution was going to be, considering some of the things I already mentioned. Skepticism, you know, we're not done until we're done. We might need to get different kinds of evidence from our clients than we had in the past, and how that was going to work. Inventory observations were already mentioned. So, but you know, to end on a positive note, like I began, I think overall you step back and you say clients in many cases made a very clean transition to remote.
Yeah, Jim, that was certainly our experience as well. I mean, certainly the impact of the pandemic on the business and some of the estimates was really had a profound effect in many cases on how those processes operated. But you covered a number of other areas more broadly, right? That were really impactful. I mean, I guess maybe Christopher, turning it back to you. I guess, you know, you talked a little bit about some of the things you put in place last year, you know, to help navigate the virtual environment, and you know, Jen mentioned a number of things that companies were implementing. All of that, you know, probably now that we're, you know, a year out from, you know, when we first had to think about them, and we've been through one, you know, kind of financial reporting cycle, at least for the calendar year ends, and we're rounding home on a second financial reporting cycle for the off year ends. Have you guys started thinking about, you know, any of those approaches that both we took, or maybe even the companies took, that we think could have some staying power, if you will, and how it may, how it may be enhancing the auditor's kind of toolbox on a go forward basis?
Well, first, I just want to comment to Jen's comment about it actually was amazing how quickly and seamlessly everyone moved to the virtual environment. I actually was pretty surprised that we had such a quick response from both the client side and team side. I think it really ended up working out quite well. Transitioning that thought now to the tools, I think everyone on this call, including BDO, we had the tools already. The tools were in the toolbox. There was very little new gadgets or things that were needed to be available to us. I think we've all evolved to have flexible teamwork environments. So I think what the pandemic did is it accelerated the use of them and increased the depth and breadth of the use of the tools. Examples like the portal tool that we have to manage the exchange, securely manage the exchange of data, or our audit process tool for planning and execution, Harmony tool for extraction and harmonization of data, Advantage for data analytics in Microsoft Teams. Everybody has a version of these tools in their tool chest, and I think we all use them quite well. When you look at the auditing, you know, we clearly have less travel, right? So we weren't going to client locations, client sites, we're doing it virtually. So we embraced, and I think others also did this, virtual audit rooms. We created virtual audit rooms for teams to work on. Microsoft Teams was a great tool for doing that. I think when you ask, is something going to continue? I think that has a lot of staying power. We also increased video conferencing instead of in-person meetings. I think that also has staying power. It has flexibility, and that flexibility increased participation. We believe probably there's going to be more use of virtual inventory observations. There have to be the right conditions. So when it's suitable to do so, we think that might be around. One of the other things we did, as Dave, you mentioned earlier, I think everyone also did this, we really reinforced the need for the additional procedures that you need to do in a virtual environment when receiving information from a client. How do you validate, look at the veracity and authenticity of that information, confirming the content with third parties, or finding other forms of corroboration. And lastly, I think we issued and we're now reinforcing virtual guides on how to work virtually, what to do, how to authenticate audit evidence virtually, how to interact with clients virtually, and how to stay on top of an engagement, how to manage it virtually. I think those are some things that, as you look forward, have some staying power. I think we're going to be in this sort of split team, split environment, split teams with clients, split teams with our teams, where some team members are virtual, some team members are in person. Some clients want 100%, partial, none in person. I think we all, this is a new future. And so all these things, these wonderful tools that our firms have invested in, I think they were timely. Thank God they were there, because I don't know what we would have done without them. But they were quite impactful to allowing us to, as Jen mentioned earlier, sort of seamlessly transition into a completely virtual environment.
Christopher, I think that's extremely well said. I guess I have to admit I was surprised too about how, you kind of thought when we started this, it'd be a couple of weeks to be back in the office. So I'd admit I didn't take it overly seriously the first few weeks that we'd be at this, but it did seem tremendously easy to how you can maintain some team dynamics. And it's been interesting to see in my perspective how companies are evolving as well. You mentioned virtual inventories. We started to hear, calls from companies that, internal audit is saying, hey, look, we did virtual inventories too. And we think this could be a tool that we leverage within our internal control structure to help support some of our financial statement assertions. So let's, what do you think? And, and we're kind of, our teams are asking the same questions. So it is interesting. It does seem like in a number of areas, enhancing kind of as you said, a lot of those tools existed, right? But enhancing their availability and the confidence by which they may be leveraged will certainly seem to be having an impact.
Most definitely.
Well, maybe transitioning, that's a good point, maybe to transition next, which is we talked a little bit about kind of the impact, on our teams and how, Christopher, you mentioned a number of things around how technology kind of helped enable that. And Jen, you mentioned a number of things as well. You think about this, when we started, the traditional kind of way audits were performed, where you had audit teams kind of huddled in a really tiny conference room around a little tiny conference table and, for all hours of the night, is likely, at least as we come out of it, is kind of fundamentally changed, right? On some levels, as well as our ability to walk down the hall and knock on the controller or other company personnel's door to kind of get answers, where kind of fundamentally how you go about performing the audit is changing. And I guess that brings the question up, as you think about our team and the fact that our teams largely consist of individuals on, varying levels of the experience scale, keeping kind of a team environment, where, folks are motivated, engaged, they understand what they're doing and the importance of what they're doing, could present some challenges in this environment where you don't kind of have that built-in kind of physical presence. And so, Jen, maybe I'll turn it over to you and say, did you guys kind of see some of those challenges, and what are some of the things you found that teams were able to execute to help maintain kind of those team dynamics kind of effectively?
Well, the first was the invention of the Zoom happy hour, which was widely embraced. And in all seriousness, I think communication, collaboration sort of circumstances would be the three focuses. The first very much remains true today, which is the well-being of our people, and how are they feeling. And this really is an individual, team by team, person by person, important area to keep your finger on the pulse of. So the flexibility, I hope, Christopher, might have been on your list of things that will stay. I think for us, flexibility is around for a while. I'm sure for everybody else. But it's really just keeping an eye on how people are feeling, because this is bigger than the profession and ourselves and all that. And so how folks are coping. I also think, we've instituted things like disconnect days. So for the July 4th holiday, we had 5 days off where we really didn't have a lot of interaction, sort of emergency issues only that arose that necessitated messaging. So things of that nature, I think we've all probably adopted a greater level of empathy. In terms of the engagement and motivation, I think for us, one of the things we did was really constant messaging. And that messaging was the messages we've already talked about around skepticism and judgments, and getting sufficient evidence, but it was also messages around it's okay to reach out for help. We had mental health specialists join some of our leadership webcasts to talk about coping skills. We, we have taken a particular focus for our younger folks, realizing we had new hires who, they spend months just looking at a computer screen, and while virtual is nice and you can meet people on virtual, we're working now on what, how to bring live experiences to those younger populations first, because they have really only lived their professional careers virtually. And then the connection point, Christopher mentioned open Zoom rooms. For sure, we had that. So you would it's as if you were in a room, even if nobody was talking, you'd have cameras on, and just the ability to have that casual conversation. I think your point about being able to walk down the hall and talk to the client is also a really important one, and how we were able to keep up that kind of connection and collaboration between the team and the client was also very important. So lots of stuff. I guess I'd end with a purpose statement, which is we also spend a lot of time reminding everybody of our purpose in the capital markets, and that the importance of getting it right. And we were going to do so flexibly and with collaboration in a different way than we had in the past. But that fundamental of the purpose we served remained the same. And I think that engaged a lot of folks as well.
Yeah. No, I think that's well said, Jen. And I guess, maybe just building on your comments around, kind of flexibility and well-being. I mean, one of the things that I know everybody was probably struck with is the fact that, the pandemic and the shift to virtual impacted everyone a little differently. We've all heard, kind of stories of the first or second year, kind of folks, living 3 or 4 to an apartment, a 1-bedroom apartment in New York, kind of huddled around around a coffee table, trying to work, right? But then at the same time, on as you move around the spectrum, you had young parents, right, who managing 2 jobs and lack of childcare, and so the work dynamics, the business day would often get extended, right? Because people were doing shifts, right? And having to manage how they could manage caring for their young ones or other family members while, maintaining flexibility with their significant other. And others may just have been dealing with, just challenges with being the kind of the remoteness. All of us, I'm sure, felt at various points being kind of stuck in your house, right? And so, I think one of the things around, it really kind of put a finer point on how we maintain some of those connections during this whole environment. And maybe Dave, you could maybe spend a few minutes speaking to kind of some of the things. I know Jen mentioned a few things that Deloitte did, but a few things maybe from your perspective that you saw the firm and maybe teams do to really help manage through that process to make sure the team members felt supported, but that obviously, we all could still continue to move forward on our very important, kind of mandate.
Yep. Josh, you said it. It's an interesting one, right? There were many aspects of the pandemic that were like a shared experience, but yet other aspects were fairly unique, person to person, family to family. But I'll play off Jen's comments. I think we tried to work to meet each team member where they were, right? One by one, so to speak. And in some cases, it was easy to see the challenges, but in others, you needed to check in and talk to understand where people were and what their needs were and so forth. And we needed to invest the time to do that. So we ramped up coaching and connectivity, activities where needed. Sometimes it was more intensive coaching for those that needed help, working more independently for part of the day, or simply investing time in connectivity with those living alone, for example, to help break up the day or the weekends, as the case may be. I say this partially joking, after all, not everyone was lucky enough to have too many people under one roof for so long at the same time with kids coming back from college and so forth. Of course, I'm joking because it was definitely what many people regard as a silver lining to the pandemic, right? Of being together as a family. In any event, we encouraged every team to stay connected as a team and figure out what each other needed and how to support one another. And we supplemented that and Jen touched on this as well, I'll say additional working at home support efforts at the market team and firm levels, including focusing on our well-being programs. And one last point I'd make to round it out, Josh, is, I think importantly reminded everyone, including the roommate scenario that you touched on, of the need to maintain client confidentiality given some of the shared living situations, which was important during that time frame, just to bring some of the quality considerations in as well.
Yeah, thanks. Great point. While you were chatting, Dave, I guess we had a question come in through the chat around how have performance evaluations changed over this time period, and while it's focused on, the question was focused on staff, I thought it might be interesting for the group to know. I suspect we're all in kind of a similar kind of place, but I guess what constitutes a leader in this environment, given all of the challenges Dave, you and Jen just articulated in terms of how it impacts team dynamics, how we maintain client relationships. Christopher, speaking to a number of the points you raised earlier as well, right? What it takes to be successful in this environment, right, is I think really continuing to evolve what we think a strong kind of effective leader is in this environment. And I would say this has really brought forth, at least from our, from an executive level down, right, the need to further be open-minded to kind of flexibility, to well-being, right, to make sure, and that extends not only to our team, right, first and foremost, right, but also in terms of how we translate those behaviors into our interactions with our clients, right, and what that looks like in this environment. And so I would say from a staff perspective, it's probably more focused now on making sure there's more proactiveness on their outreach and how and their level of engagement, navigating kind of what this kind of, in-person mix with virtual. But I think probably what I think is most impactful from my perspective is really how you're driving kind of that tone and leadership from the highest levels on the engagement in the firm and things like that. And so I'll pause there to see if there are any reactions from you guys on that point. But I thought that question, given where we were in the presentation, was helpful to kind of try to provide some perspective to at this stage.
There's a lot of thought being put into how we interact with the professionals and we keep that cadence of interaction up, including evaluations, mentoring, strategic direction, career development, skill set development. And I think all the firms, including ours, are really focused on how we simulate and approximate what we've been doing when in person in a virtual environment. I'm not sure that the full book has been written yet. I think we all are putting things in place. It's evolving. We're doing things differently, and it's going to take a year for it to all sort of shake out as we get the new work environment in our hands and in a sort of a normal cadence of interaction, to figure out which things really are impactful in helping employees and professionals thrive. And it's a whole toolkit. It's not one thing, it's a bunch of things.
Yeah, I think I appreciate that, because I think it's well said. I mean, I guess maybe, in some respects, I guess you start thinking about what you just said, and maybe you translate that back into kind of audits we're working on today a little bit, right? And so, think about, this time last year, we were working on off-year end. Many of our teams were working on off-year end audits, and we had, kind of been in a hybrid where we'd been on site for, 9 months, and then boom, we're spending the last, 3 to 4 months kind of working from home in this kind of strange environment. And now for those 630, 730 year ends now, right, we spent a whole year, right, in many cases not able to interact, kind of in person, but only virtually. recognizing, a number of the things we've talked about already in terms of how we manage, we've managed through this environment and some of the best practices, I guess stepping back and thinking about what it takes, to really, now that we've maybe spent a longer period of time than we initially thought about really interacting in that in person and really being able to, to get some of those down the hall kind of conversations. Have you guys seen or done anything really to help reemphasize, at least in that, in that environment, right? Any, additional kind of behaviors or techniques to really help and make sure we haven't, I'll say missed anything based on the interactions over the last year, the lack of in-person interactions over the last year?
Well, I'll start with just a couple things. So I think you're right. The virtual environments run the risk of reducing client connectivity, right? And so I think we're focused on leading proactive interactions led by partner involvement, getting out there to the clients. I think people are thinking the time frame in the field is limited. So we're trying to figure out how that can be most impactful on both audit execution and client connectivity. So planning that level of connection and that on-site activity more carefully with a lot more thought. Engaging in timely discussions with our clients about what is going to look like. Are we on site? Are we not on site? Are we partially on site? And what is going to go back to pre-pandemic norm and what isn't, so that we don't have an expectation gap with clients, which is a very serious issue if you do. Focusing on, which I think Dave mentioned earlier, focusing on risk assessment early, concept of split teams, making sure the client understands that and we understand it about the client. And focusing on controls early. I think, Dave, you also mentioned that earlier, and I think I made a comment on that. Focusing on controls early is really, really important. Controls and processes, and what's changed and how they're going to affect our audits, which is most important aspect of that. Those are some thoughts to start with. That's the opening salvo, Dave and Jen, for you.
Well, I can chip in a couple of thoughts to that, Josh. I think, in some ways we look back and we say, wow, that March 2020 timeframe was really a challenge when everybody shifted to remote. And in some ways, I think it'll be a greater challenge as the variation is going to continue for some time in terms of how are our teams feeling, where's the client at, back to what I said at the start, where are their global operations at? And so there's still as many, if not more, variables than there were right at the start of this. So we like Christopher mentioned, are having teams really consider kind of what's imperative to be on site with the client, what makes sense to do with the client, but that you can do virtually. When does just the team need to be together? And that's probably a piece that, for some, it sort of started as we're either going to be at the client or everybody's going to be working home alone. And I think as our offices have begun to reopen and we're phasing that in, it's okay, it might make sense for the team to be together, but they don't necessarily need to be on the client premises. So when are those circumstances? And then finally back to, okay, well, when are folks going to work as they have been for the last 15 months, kind of individually at home? And do you carry on things even for that work with like the open Zoom rooms? So it has to be a really thoughtful exercise, and it will probably continue to change just as we, read in the news with variants and things of that nature. So it's almost like where we were last year. It's a little bit more optimism that we're getting closer to the end, but still the need for teams to remember all the lessons of the past year and just reapply them to those variables that are slightly different this year as different geographies and clients get back in the office or not.
Josh, I think the words that come to mind, Jen just said thoughtful, which is great. I think what we learned together, right, is we just needed, as we're approaching the hybrid conversation, right? And you mentioned client relationships, maintaining culture, team building. I think what we learned was we just needed to be much more intentional and purposeful in planning the interactions to drive those activities, whether it was the client interactions or the team interactions, or the things that are important to market teams and firm level team building activities and connectivity to maintain culture. I think, and Christopher said this, right? The prior investments in things like virtual collaboration tools, digital upskilling, and one that we haven't mentioned, our collective experience working with remote team member models, delivery centers and the like, helped us adapt, to the new normal, so to speak. But I guess as we ease into the hybrid conversation, and I'll pass it back, Josh, it just seems that I think we're all really looking forward to the return to the workplace, notwithstanding, right? In terms of being with clients, being with colleagues in person. But we've made working remotely work. And that probably makes a case for the hybrid model, right? Or hybrid models, because there are a bunch of them.
Yeah, Dave, I think that makes sense, and maybe it's a nice entree, I think, into kind of what we think this is going to look like maybe longer term. I know there's a few questions that have been posed around, really around how we plan on managing this long term, and I think you, Jen, and Christopher, you've all talked about, hey, look, at least in the near term, right? It's gonna be a mix, right? Because our clients are in different positions. Our people are in different positions, right? The world is in different positions. And so it's kind of almost like right now, it's kind of a forced, kind of hybrid, if you will, because that's what's needed in order to, because of where everybody is right now. But as you think maybe, perhaps maybe a few years down the road, maybe we can transition to that type of discussion where, we don't, have to start every conversation with how is COVID doing and impacting your life every day when we chat, right? We can be thinking about what this means. And, I think, I guess, Jen, maybe just start with you, I guess, as you guys have been thinking about it, do you think, and I think I probably know the answer because I think we've kind of already kind of been saying this as well, right? But it does seem like fundamentally, right, the audit kind of delivery process is going to be fundamentally impacted at some level, right, by the fact that we've gone through this hybrid, kind of environment, and it's come through, and seemed to work reasonably well for a number of ways. And so maybe as you guys think about kind of future state, is that kind of consistent with how you guys are thinking about it? And what are maybe some of the key things that are kind of helping guide your thinking around from that perspective?
Well, I guess I should start by saying I don't have a crystal ball for 3 years out, and it's much safer to stay in the territory, or how are we going to make it through the next 9 to 12 months? And right. Flexibility is the key word there. But I do think the earlier discussions around, there are definitely benefits of the COVID, if you can say that are here to stay. Whether that's use of video technology or virtual inventory observations. I think is probably a separate hour-long conversation on how to maximize that. And we did talk about data analytics and things of that nature. So I do think we need to keep our eyes on it. One interesting thing to tie yesterday's conversation and today's is, as we all sort of take the plunge into ESG, and maybe that's non-traditional areas for us as auditors, is that something that would make us, we might need to meet new pieces of our clients in terms of that, and how does that interact with our remote working? I think, we nailed it, so to speak, with the folks we knew and the financial reporting and ICFR and doing the financial statement audit. As we all evolve into other areas of assurance, how does that impact our hybrid environment? What would we say for some new subject matters we might encounter, those things that we'd want to be on site and talking to folks about face to face the first time around, and things of that nature. Certainly, I think Christopher mentioned it earlier around fraud risks. There are definitely things where we want to go back to pre-pandemic face-to-face conversations. So it continues to be a mix. I wish I had all the answers. I'd package them up and sell them. But as we used to say last year, the situation remains fluid.
Yeah, no, I think that obviously that makes sense, Jen. And I think it's interesting, right? Because I think some of the things we've seen on our end is, one of the benefits of a hybrid model going forward is perhaps you can, leverage resources across regions a little bit more effectively. And so thinking about our younger people or our broader workforce, you can open up opportunities for them, differently than what may have been obvious before, right? And so I don't know if Dave, Christopher, if those are things you guys have been seeing. I know our clients in some cases are stepping back and saying, well, do I need to reserve half a floor for my audit team now, right? To take up space, or can we be more thoughtful around how we, and Dave, to use your words, a little more deliberate around how we manage some of those interactions? Certainly not necessarily, right, with the lens of reducing the overall amount of interaction, but just can we be more, intentional around how we do that to benefit both you and us from a resource perspective. But just curious as to some of those kind of what you guys are seeing in those spaces, or maybe some other related kind of matters from that perspective.
Yeah, I mean, those things are real, Josh, right? I mean, there's like risks and opportunities to all of this. I think it's all about quality, putting audit quality first, the quality client service, and importantly, the quality of the experience for our team members. And so, it's kind of interesting to say out loud, right? So work as we knew it has changed forever in all likelihood. That's okay. I personally find some of the hybrid model attributes to potentially be very exciting, and it could be even better for our people. And, many clients were already good at working virtually with the virtual collaboration tools and bringing their own people together periodically, and others are catching up quickly. I think one point I would tease out here is, as we look to year 2, so to speak, and beyond, not only do we need to stay focused on the client and people experience, but, we have a shared interest in the profession, and I think we need to keep finding ways to keep making the profession exciting and interesting and engaging, for people, joining the profession, from campus, so to speak. And that has got to be the case, whether they're working on audits or whether they're working on ESG, like Jen mentioned, right? And so somehow in all of this, we have to keep it fresh, exciting, engaging, no matter what model work model we're working in.
Josh, you're about to go to Q&A because we're at that lovely 10 minutes too. But to give a kind of a final thought on what Dave was referring to and responding to your question, I think flexibility has a new sort of meaning. We've always looked at flexibility, and I think the firms have really focused on it in a way of engaging and retaining people. But I think making sure that our people are focused on the right work, right time, right location is really important. And how you do that is probably more important. That is not an assignment. That is not a directive. That is a deeply engaged discussion between our professionals and their teams and the people they report to. And there's no one right answer. It's something that's very different for each person based on their role, responsibility, their client responsibilities. So both their internal organizational responsibilities and clients. So remote working is here to stay. Flexibility's got a whole new meaning, sort of a right fit feel to it. And we all have to get on the bus with it, because it is here to stay and it's highly impactful. And I agree with Dave. I actually think it's going to bring great things for our firms and for the profession. I think it's actually, the pandemic really did us a favor. It's really helped us accelerate something that should have been at this level already.
Yeah, I think that's well said. Not only your response to the question, but your notice that we needed to move into a little bit of the Q&A as well.
But we got to get to the Q&A.
But and I will notice we did have a number of questions in the chat box that really highlighted how are younger people being impacted by this. And I think, Christopher, some of the comments one, I'll highlight that I think the next session is intended to provide maybe a little bit deeper perspective on that. But I think, Christopher, some of your comments around a lot of our people, I think, really appreciate having the flexibility, right? At the same time, particularly in the current environment, right, it's not something they ever had in their mind as part of as they're thinking about being an auditor, because for interns who other than ones who just interned last year, right, they're used to the kind of teaming and camaraderie, right? So I would say, particularly Christopher, you mentioned earlier, maybe Jen, you mentioned it's all kind of evolving, right? But I think over time, what we're seeing is it's a balancing act, right? How do you get the interactions, the quality of the interactions differently than what everybody grew up expecting, while at the same time appreciating that everyone likes a little bit of flexibility, right? From that perspective. And so I think the next panel will probably provide a little more flavor on how we're managing through that. But I do think that's kind of the theme of a few questions. One of the questions was, I think a couple of them are connected, but they kind of get back to what keeps us up at night in this new environment, kind of what this new normal looks like, right? In terms of where, maybe audit teams aren't, if you were, the senior manager on an audit team and you used to have everybody in a room and you kind of monitor what's going on, or as a new partner on an audit, right? In this new kind of new normal, kind of what keeps you up at night? And I guess I'll start and maybe just ask for reactions. I think, and I think, Christopher, building off what you said, it's really being, it's really maintaining kind of the discipline, right? To ask all of the questions you need to ask, to be thoughtful around who you're interacting with, how you interact, and how you follow up with those questions, both on how you're understanding what's impacting the company and how they're operating, right? So that we can plan and design the audit effectively, but then how we're evaluating the evidence and maintaining kind of the right touch points. We're asking the right questions, we're gathering the right evidence, and we instill that throughout the audit team to make sure they understand what good looks like in this environment, because now you got to set up meetings, right? Virtually versus walk down the hall and keep hounding someone until you get the information you need, right? For lack of a better way to say that, right? But I think as I think about it, it's kind of the longer term, how that all comes together from an audit execution perspective, as well as how you maintain kind of the qualities of the apprenticeship model in this environment. And I think that's one thing we're continually all working on from that perspective. But maybe I'll shut up and throw it to the group for any reactions from that perspective.
I think you're spot on, and part of it comes also to in my mind, to supervision, right? So our supervisor remodel is really different in a virtual world. And so there's the, just the on-the-job training and the interaction and the culture building. And then there is the, what does it change what you might review or how you might supervise and direct, and then you expand that when you have locations that are further away from you. So the direction and supervision, I think, is evolving. We talked about it earlier in terms of what does a good leader in this COVID remote look like, and how do those skills change, and how do we prepare our leaders of the future for this new world? The other thing that I think about is professional skepticism, and I think we are all probably thinking through that, is how do you maintain that level of professional skepticism? When do you need to be kind of eyeball to eyeball and asking questions about certain topics? And so continuing to work through that. I think everybody does love the flexibility, myself included, but I also like coming back and meeting with teams and, being in the same room as folks. And so I think that balance is just one of those things that we'll have to keep our eyes on.
Jen, adding to your professional skepticism, it's maintaining it, but actually teaching it in a remote environment, teaching people how to be skeptical, teaching people how to avoid being incrementally marginalized. At BDO, I can't tell you how many people hear me talk about incremental marginalization, the many tiny bites at the apple that finally disappear the apple and move you from point A to point B. So micro influencing that gets you off the thing you're looking into. And clients can be masters at this. And how do we teach people to be wary of it and to stay on guard and to stay on point and to avoid pitfalls, professional skepticism pitfalls being anchored, rushing to solve, all these things that we try to teach our professionals. Probably the most important thing that keeps me up at night is, how do you keep people engaged remotely? How do you keep them from looking at it as a job and thinking about it as a profession, being excited, being focused, being deeply engaged in the moment of auditing? And that's the secret sauce. If we can all solve that, our profession will be alive and well in a remote environment.
Well, I think that was a great point, maybe to close on, Christopher. Appreciate you just saying all those things, as well as, really wanted to just reach out and thank all of our panelists for really spending time today. I think it was an excellent discussion, and really appreciate all of the perspectives you all brought with respect to how we're navigating what is currently obviously has been a challenging environment, and poses lots of interesting questions for us to work through as a profession here in the future.